Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading to Mauritania, and I'll be honest, when I started researching this country, I thought I knew what I was getting into. Desert nation, northwestern Africa, probably some interesting Saharan history. And then I discovered that this place has a geological formation so bizarre and massive that astronauts use it as a landmark from space, that it didn't criminalize slavery until 2007, and that its capital city went from a tiny fishing village of a few hundred people to a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million in just 60 years. Mauritania is the kind of place where the desert is actively eating towns, where you can still find people living fully nomadic lives, herding camels across landscapes that would kill you in about 48 hours without preparation, and where the entire country, an area larger than Egypt, has fewer people than Phoenix, Arizona. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and if you're enjoying these deep dives on countries you've probably never thought much about, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. Let's talk about Mauritania. Chapter 1, Where Sand Meets Everything Else. Right, let's start with the most important thing you need to understand about Mauritania. It is aggressively, relentlessly, almost comically a desert. We're talking 90% Sahara coverage. If you drew Mauritania on a map and coloured it according to what the land actually looks like, you'd use one colour for sand, one colour for slightly different sand, and a tiny sliver of green in the south where the Senegal River has somehow convinced a few plants to stay alive. Picture this. You're standing in the geographic centre of Mauritania, which is, let's be clear, an extremely bad decision, but let's pretend you've got supplies and a death wish. You look north, sand dunes stretching to Algeria. You look east, more sand dunes heading toward Mali. You look west, flat desert plains marching toward the Atlantic coast. You look south. Okay, fine, there's some scrubby vegetation if you squint, but we're still essentially talking about sand that's trying really hard to be less sandy. The whole country covers just over 1 million square kilometres, which makes it roughly the size of Egypt or about twice the size of France, and almost all of it is landscape that wants you dead. But here's the thing about deserts, they're not boring. Hostile, yes. Actively murderous if you're unprepared, absolutely. But boring, never. Mauritania's got terrain that ranges from vast seas of rolling orange dunes to dramatic rocky plateaus that look like they were carved by a deity with a flair for the theatrical. In the north-central region you've got the Adrar Plateau, which is basically a massive chunk of ancient rock that decided to stick around while erosion demolished everything around it. The escarpments here drop away so sharply it feels like the earth just gave up halfway through. And scattered across this plateau are these stunning oases, little pockets of date palms and groundwater that have kept people alive for thousands of years. Then there's the Richat Structure. Oh, you're going to love this. Imagine a perfect bullseye carved into the desert, 50 kilometers across, with concentric rings of rock that are so geometrically precise that when astronauts first saw it from space, they thought it had to be an impact crater. It's not. It's a geological formation created by erosion, eating away at a dome of layered rock over millions of years, and it looks so surreal that locals call it the Eye of the Sahara. You can see it from the International Space Station. It's been used as a landmark by space missions since the 1960s. And it's just sitting there in the middle of the Mauritanian desert, being inexplicably perfect and mildly unsettling. Now let's talk about what it feels like to actually be in this landscape, because the numbers don't quite capture it. Summer temperatures regularly push past 45 degrees Celsius. That's 113 Fahrenheit for anyone keeping track, and the air is so dry that any moisture on your skin evaporates before you even notice you're sweating. The harmattan winds blow in from the Sahara carrying so much fine dust that the entire sky turns this hazy orange-brown colour, like someone's Instagram filter got stuck on apocalyptic sunset. Sandstorms roll through with enough force to strip paint off buildings and bury entire vehicles. This is not pack sunscreen and you'll be fine territory. This is respect the desert or it will absolutely end you territory. Rainfall? Adorable that you asked. Most of the country gets less than 100 millimeters of rain per year, which in practical terms means almost never. The far south, where Mauritania bleeds into the Sahel zone, gets slightly more during the brief rainy season, but we're still talking about an environment where water scarcity isn't a problem, it's the problem. It's the central organizing fact of life. Every settlement, every migration pattern, every historical conflict, every modern infrastructure project comes back to the same question. Where is the water and how do we get it? Which brings us to the Senegal River, the only permanent river in the entire country and quite possibly the most important geographic feature Mauritania possesses. It runs along the entire southern border with Senegal, about 550 kilometres of flowing water in a region where flowing water is essentially a miracle. The river valley is where you find actual greenery, crops, trees, villages that don't have to move every few months to find grazing land for their animals. If you're a farmer in Mauritania, you're almost certainly within spitting distance of this river, because everywhere else is just sand trying to figure out new and creative ways to make agriculture impossible. The rest of the country's water features are what hydrologists politely call intermittent, which means dry riverbeds that occasionally remember they're supposed to have water in them after rare rainstorms. These wadis snake across the landscape like geological memories of a wetter past, and they're actually super important for traditional nomadic routes, because even when they're dry, they often indicate where you might find groundwater if you dig deep enough. And deep enough is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence. We're talking wells that can go down 100 meters or more. But Mauritania does have one massive geographic asset that doesn't require digging holes in the sand. An Atlantic coastline that stretches for about 750 kilometers. And these aren't just scenic beaches, although they are that. These are some of the richest fishing waters in the world, thanks to the cold Canary Current that sweeps down from the north and creates this phenomenon called upwelling, where deep, nutrient-rich water gets pushed to the surface. Fish love it. Seabirds love it. Industrial fishing fleets from Europe and Asia absolutely love it, which has created some, let's call them diplomatic tensions over fishing rights that we'll get into later. The Banque d'Arguin National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site sprawled along the northern coast, is one of the most important bird sanctuaries in the entire world. Millions of migratory birds, flamingos, pelicans, terns, you name it, stop here on their way between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. It's this weird ecological miracle where the Sahara Desert just abruptly slams into tidal flats and mangrove swamps, and somehow the combination creates a haven for wildlife. You've got monk seals, dolphins, sea turtles, and enough bird species to keep ornithologists happy for years. It's genuinely stunning, and also completely at odds with the whole endless, murderous desert vibe that defines the rest of the country. Speaking of things trying not to die in the desert, vegetation. It exists, technically. In the south, you've got acacia trees with their iconic umbrella-shaped canopies, some hardy desert grasses, and thorny shrubs that look like they're angry about having to grow in such hostile conditions. Date palms cluster around oases, producing fruit that's been a staple food source for desert peoples for millennia. But mostly, if you're looking at Mauritanian flora, you're looking at plants that have evolved extremely aggressive survival strategies, deep root systems, tiny leaves to minimize water loss, the ability to go dormant for months or years until it rains. These plants do not mess around. The fauna is similarly tough. You've got animals like the addax, antelope and Dorcas gazelle, both of which can survive for months without drinking water because they've figured out how to extract moisture from the plants they eat. Fennec foxes with their massive ears, which aren't just adorable, their heat radiators hunt at night when temperatures drop. Desert monitor lizards bask on rocks during the day and disappear into burrows when things get too hot. Everything here is either nocturnal, nomadic, or has developed some kind of biological cheat code for handling extreme heat and zero water. But here's the genuinely troubling part. The desert is winning. Desertification, the process of previously habitable land turning into desert, is not a future threat in Mauritania. It's happening right now, and it's accelerating. The Sahara is expanding southward at a pace that's honestly alarming, swallowing up grazing land, burying villages under sand dunes, turning marginal farmland into moonscape. Climate change is making everything worse. Less rainfall, higher temperatures, more intense droughts. There are towns in northern Mauritania that have been partially or completely abandoned because the sand literally buried them. 1 year you've got a functioning settlement. 5 years later it's half consumed by a dune that's still moving. And yet, people live here. Roughly 4.5 million of them, which sounds like a lot until you remember that's spread across an area larger than Egypt. Population density in the interior desert regions is so low that you could drive for hours, days, even without seeing another human being. Most Mauritanians live either along that precious Senegal River valley in the south, or clustered along the Atlantic coast, where Nouakchott, the capital, has grown from a tiny village of maybe 500 people in 1960 to a sprawling city of over 1 million today. That's a population increase of 2,000% in 60 years, which is the kind of explosive urban growth that generally indicates rural people fleeing somewhere even worse. The interior, meanwhile, is still the domain of nomadic pastoralists, people who move with their herds of camels, goats and sheep, following ancient routes between seasonal grazing areas and water sources. It's a lifestyle that's existed for thousands of years, and it's still practiced by a significant chunk of the population, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it. In a world of smartphones and satellite internet, there are Mauritanians living the exact same way their ancestors did in the medieval period, because it's the only way to survive in an environment this unforgiving. Underneath all this sand, though, Mauritania is sitting on some serious mineral wealth. Iron ore deposits in the Zouarat region are among the largest in the world. We're talking reserves that have kept industrial mining operations running since the 1960s. There's copper, gypsum, phosphates, and gold scattered across various regions. And in the early 2000s, offshore oil fields were discovered along the Atlantic coast, which suddenly made Mauritania a lot more interesting to foreign investors and a lot more complicated politically. So here's what you need to hold in your head as we move forward. Mauritania is a country defined by absence. Absence of water, absence of arable land, absence of dense population centres outside a few key areas. But it's also defined by what it does have a strategic position, bridging North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, a coastline with some of the world's richest fishing grounds, mineral resources that could theoretically fund serious development, and a landscape so stark and beautiful and inhospitable that it's shaped every aspect of the culture and history we're about to dig into. Right, now that you've got the geographic foundation, let's talk about who actually showed up to this unforgiving patch of sand and thought, yes, this seems like a great place to build a civilization. Chapter 2. When the Sahara wasn't trying to kill everyone. Okay, so we've established that modern Mauritania is basically a masterclass in hostile environments. But here's the thing that's going to mess with your head a bit. It wasn't always like this. Rewind about 10,000 years, and the Sahara, that vast, murderous expanse of sand we just spent an entire section describing, was green. Like, genuinely green. Grasslands, lakes, rivers, the whole deal. You could have gone on a safari there and seen elephants, giraffes, hippos and crocodiles. I'm not making this up. We know this because of the rock art. Throughout the Adrar Plateau and other parts of what's now Mauritania, there are these stunning prehistoric paintings and engravings showing people herding cattle, hunting wildlife that hasn't lived in the region for 5,000 years, and generally living lives that look nothing like the desperate water conservation strategies required today. These weren't just scattered doodles, this was sophisticated art created by Neolithic peoples who practiced agriculture and pastoralism in an environment that could actually support those things. They had permanent settlements, they grew crops, they didn't have to move every few months because the desert was eating their grazing land. And then, starting around 3000 BCE, the climate shifted. The rains stopped coming. The grasslands dried up. The animals migrated south or died out. And the people who'd been living here had a choice: leave or adapt to an environment that was rapidly transforming into one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Some left, some adapted. The ones who stayed became the ancestors of the Berber groups who would dominate this region for the next several millennia, and they figured out how to not just survive but thrive in conditions that would absolutely wreck most civilizations. The Berbers, also called Amazigh, which means free people, in their language weren't a single unified group. They were a collection of tribes and confederations spread across North Africa, and the ones who ended up in what's now Mauritania were primarily part of the Sanhadja Confederation. These were pastoral nomads who'd mastered the art of desert survival, following seasonal rainfall patterns, knowing where every reliable water source was located, breeding animals that could handle extreme temperatures and scarce vegetation. They lived in tents woven from goat hair that could be packed up and moved in a few hours. They navigated using stars, landmarks, and an intimate knowledge of the desert that got passed down through generations. This was their landscape, and they knew every deadly inch of it. But the real game changer, the innovation that transformed the Sahara from borderline impassable death trap to still extremely dangerous but theoretically crossable with proper planning, was the camel. Camels were domesticated around the 4th century CE, and their arrival in the Sahara was like someone inventing the internal combustion engine. Suddenly you had an animal that could carry heavy loads, go for days without water, eat vegetation that would kill a horse, and handle temperature swings that range from scorching daytime heat to near freezing nights. Camels meant you could cross the desert, and if you could cross the desert, you could trade. And oh, did people want to trade? Because here's what was happening. West Africa had gold, lots of it. The gold fields south of the Sahara were producing wealth that made Mediterranean kingdoms salivate with envy. Meanwhile, the Sahara had salt specifically, massive deposits in places like the Taghaza mines, and salt was absolutely critical for human survival in hot climates where you sweat constantly. In some markets, salt was traded pound for pound with gold. Let that sink in. A pound of salt for a pound of gold. That's not a commodity market, that's alchemy. The trade routes that connected these regions cut straight through Mauritanian territory, and whoever controlled the oases and passage points along those routes controlled staggering amounts of wealth. Enter the Ghana Empire. No, not modern Ghana, completely different place. Ancient Ghana was located in what's now southeastern Mauritania and parts of Mali, with its capital at Kumbi Saleh. And it flourished from roughly 300 to 1200 CE by doing one thing extremely well: taxing the hell out of everyone who wanted to move gold north or salt south. The empire was built by the Soninka people, and at its peak it was fabulously, almost absurdly wealthy. Arab traders and scholars who visited wrote about kings who held court, surrounded by officials wearing gold ornaments, about elaborate ceremonies with hundreds of attendants, about a capital city with distinct quarters for Muslims and indigenous populations. The king reportedly had a monopoly on gold nuggets. Regular people could trade gold dust, but any nugget found in the kingdom belonged to the crown, which was a pretty brilliant way to corner the market on the really valuable stuff. Here's how the system worked. Caravans would arrive from the north carrying salt, luxury goods, and manufactured items from the Mediterranean world. They'd pay taxes to enter Ghana's territory. Then they'd trade with merchants from the south who'd brought gold, ivory, cola nuts, and enslaved people. Those merchants also paid taxes. Everyone paid taxes. The Ghana Empire was basically a medieval toll booth operator that happened to sit on the most profitable trade route in Africa, and it worked spectacularly until it didn't. The didn't part starts with a religious movement that kicked off in Mauritania around the 1040s. A Sanhaja Berber scholar named Abdallah ibn Yassin was deeply concerned that the Berber tribes had gotten, shall we say, a bit relaxed in their Islamic practice. Islam had been spreading through the region since the 8th and 9th centuries via those same trans-Saharan trade routes, but it had blended with local traditions in ways that stricter interpreters found problematic. Ibn Yassin wanted reform. He wanted a return to what he considered pure Islamic law, and he wanted everyone to get on board, preferably immediately. He started building support among the Sanhaja tribes, and around 1040 or so, he established a Ribat, which is basically a fortified monastery/military training camp on an island in the Senegal River. This became the headquarters for what would become known as the Almoravid movement, from Al-Murabitun, meaning those of the Ribat. And over the next few decades, this movement went from a small group of religiously motivated Berber warriors to empire spanning from Mauritania to Spain. They didn't mess around. The Almoravids were effective because they combined religious fervour with military discipline and really good timing. They united fractious Berber tribes under a common cause, trained disciplined fighting forces, and then systematically conquered territory while enforcing their interpretation of Islamic law. They swept north into Morocco, crossed into Spain, and established control over significant chunks of Al-Andalus. They founded Marrakesh in 1062, which is still a major city today, and in 1076 they conquered the Ghana Empire. Now, there's some historical debate about how devastating this conquest actually was for Ghana. Some sources describe it as a catastrophic sacking that destroyed the empire overnight. Others suggest Ghana was already in decline due to drought, internal succession disputes, and the loss of its monopoly on trade routes, and the Almoravids just delivered the final blow. Either way, by the late 11th century, Ghana's power was broken. The Almoravids were the dominant force in the region, and Mauritania had just produced a movement that would reshape politics and religion across North and West Africa. The Almoravid Empire itself didn't last much beyond the mid-1200s. Empires built on military conquest and religious zeal tend to fragment once the founding generation dies and succession disputes kick in. But the impact was permanent. Islam became deeply entrenched in Mauritanian society. Arabic spread as a language of religion and scholarship. Islamic legal traditions became the framework for resolving disputes and organizing communities. Towns that had been trade hubs became centers of Islamic learning, with scholars teaching Quranic interpretation, Islamic law, and Arabic grammar to students who'd travel for months to study there. But let's zoom out from the empire building and talk about what daily life actually looked like for most people in this period, because it wasn't all dramatic conquests and trans-Saharan commerce. The vast majority of people living in Mauritania were pastoral nomads moving between grazing areas with their animals. Camels, goats, sheep, these were your wealth, your food source, your transportation, and your insurance policy all rolled into one. You lived in tents that could be dismantled in an hour. You moved with the seasons, following rainfall and vegetation. You knew which stars to navigate by, which plants were safe to eat, how to read sand patterns to predict where you might find water. The social structure among these Berber groups was complex and rigidly hierarchical. You had warrior tribes who saw themselves as the noble class, responsible for protection and leadership. You had clerical tribes, the Zawaya, who specialized in Islamic scholarship and mediation. You had tributary tribes who paid protection money or provided services to the warriors. And at the bottom, you had groups like the Znaga Berbers who'd become subordinate to more powerful confederations and essentially functioned as a servile class. This hierarchy was based on tribal lineage and occupation, and it was not particularly flexible. Where you were born determined where you stayed. Wealth was measured in livestock and control of resources, specifically access to oases, wells, and trade routes. Raids were common. If you had camels, someone else wanted your camels. If you controlled a water source, other tribes wanted access to it. Blood feuds between tribes could last for generations, sparked by conflicts over grazing rights, stolen animals, or insults to honor that had to be avenged. It was a harsh existence even by desert standards, and survival required both individual toughness and strong group cohesion. Women in these nomadic societies had specific but critical roles. Men handled herding and long-distance movement of animals. Women managed the camps, processed milk into various preserved forms that could last for months, wove textiles, raised children, and maintained the oral traditions that preserved tribal history. And speaking of oral traditions, these were absolutely central to Berber culture. In societies without widespread literacy, griots, oral historians, and musicians were the living libraries. They memorized genealogies going back dozens of generations, preserved poetry, recounted historical events, and performed at gatherings. Lose your griots, and you lose your history. Poetry itself was a major art form. Berbers composed elaborate verses about love, honor, battles, the beauty of the desert, and the nobility of their tribes. This wasn't casual stuff, these were carefully crafted works that people memorized and recited at social gatherings. A well-composed poem could enhance your status. A devastating satirical poem could ruin someone's reputation. Words had power, and the people who wielded them skillfully were respected. Some Berber groups even developed their own writing system, Tifinagh, for writing Berber languages. It's one of the few indigenous African scripts, and it's still used today by Berber communities across North Africa. But in ancient Mauritania, literacy wasn't widespread. Most knowledge transmission happened orally, through repetition, memorization, and performance. When Islamic education spread and brought Arabic literacy with it, that created a new class of literate elites who could read religious texts, write contracts, and correspond with scholars across the Islamic world. By the time we reach the end of this period, let's say the early 1300s, Mauritania is thoroughly Islamic, dominated by Berber tribal confederations with well-established hierarchies, integrated into trans-Saharan trade networks, and populated by people who've spent centuries mastering desert survival. The brief moment when the Sahara was green is ancient history. The Ghana Empire is a memory. The Almoravid Empire has fragmented. but the basic patterns of life, nomadic pastoralism, tribal organization, Islamic scholarship, and trade are firmly established, and those patterns are going to shape everything that comes next. Chapter 3: Emirates, Gum Arabic, and very expensive poetry. So the Almoravid Empire collapsed, as empires do, and Mauritania entered what historians might call a decentralized period, which is a polite way of saying nobody was clearly in charge and everyone had opinions about that. The region fragmented into competing tribal confederations, each controlling territory, trade routes, and resources through a combination of military strength, religious authority, and strategic alliances that shifted roughly as often as the desert winds. This was not chaos. Exactly, there were rules, hierarchies, and recognized power structures. But if you were hoping for a nice, clean, centralized state with clear borders and a functional bureaucracy, you were in the wrong neighborhood. The big game changer during this period was the arrival of the Bani Hassan Arabs in the 13th century. These were groups that had migrated west from Egypt, and they brought with them a warrior culture, strong military traditions, and absolutely zero interest in respecting the existing power arrangements. Over the next few centuries, they gradually took over the political and military sphere, pushing aside or subordinating the established Berber groups. This created the division that would define Mauritanian society for the next several hundred years. Hassan tribes, who were warriors and political rulers, versus Zawaya tribes, who were the religious scholars and mediators. Now, the Zawaya didn't go quietly into subordinate status. In fact, they fought back, which brings us to the Shah Buba War, a massive, decades-long conflict that ran from 1644 to 1674, and was basically a struggle over who got to run things. The Zawaya tribes, led by religious scholars who were frankly tired of being pushed around by warriors, tried to overthrow Hassan dominance. They lost badly. By the time the dust settled, the Hassan tribes had firmly established themselves as the military and political elite, and the Zawaya had to accept a role as the religious and scholarly class. Think of it as a medieval divorce settlement where one side gets the army and the other gets the library. This division created a social structure that was rigid, hereditary, and deeply hierarchical. At the top, you had the Hassan warrior tribes. Below them, the Zawaya religious scholars. Below them, the Znaga tributary groups who paid protection money and provided services. Below them, the Haratin, who were freed slaves or descendants of enslaved peoples. And at the bottom, enslaved people themselves, who had essentially zero rights and were treated as property. Your birth determined your status, and upward mobility was not a thing. If you were born into a Znaga family, you were Znaga for life, and so were your children, and their children, and so on indefinitely. Political power during this period was organised around Emirates, which sounds impressive until you realise these weren't states in any modern sense. They were dominant tribal confederations led by emirs, who were basically the most powerful and prestigious leaders within a network of allied tribes. The Emirate of Trarza in the southwest, the Emirate of Brakna along the Senegal River, the Emirate of Tagant in the central regions, the Emirate of Adrar in the north. These emirates fought each other constantly, formed temporary alliances, betrayed those alliances, raided each other's territories, and generally engaged in the kind of Game of Thrones politics that makes for great storytelling and terrible governance. An emir's power came from personal prestige, military strength, control of resources like wells and oases, and the ability to distribute wealth to followers. Succession was theoretically based on lineage, but in practice it was often contested by rival claimants which led to civil wars, assassinations, and periodic collapses of authority. And because there was no central tax system or standing army, emirs had to constantly prove their worth by leading successful raids, mediating disputes, and maintaining the loyalty of subordinate tribes. Lose that loyalty, and you'd find yourself replaced pretty quickly. But here's what's fascinating about this period. While the political situation was fractious and violent, Islamic scholarship was absolutely thriving. Towns like Chinguetti, Awadane, Tichit, and Owalata became major centers of learning, with libraries containing thousands of manuscripts on Islamic law, theology, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and poetry. These weren't huge cities by global standards, we're talking maybe a few thousand people each, but their intellectual output was significant. Scholars would travel for months to study with particular teachers, and students from across West Africa would come to Mauritania to get educated in Islamic sciences. Chinguetti in particular developed this reputation as a holy city. Some enthusiastic locals even claimed it was the 7th holiest city in Islam, which is a bit of a stretch, but it does indicate how important these scholarly centres were to regional identity. The libraries there still exist today, with ancient manuscripts on everything from Quranic interpretation to medieval astronomy, preserved by families who've been maintaining them for generations. Some of these texts are the only surviving copies of works that would otherwise be lost. So while the emirs were busy raiding each other, the scholars were quietly preserving and advancing human knowledge, priorities. Trade was still a major economic driver, but things were shifting. The trans-Saharan routes that had made the Ghana Empire rich were still operating. Caravans still hauled gold, salt, slaves, ivory, and luxury goods across the desert, but European maritime trade was starting to compete. Why spend months crossing the Sahara when you could sail around West Africa's coast and trade directly with coastal kingdoms? The economics were changing, and Mauritanian merchants had to adapt. Enter gum Arabic. This is tree resin from acacia trees, and it turns out Europeans wanted it desperately for textiles, food production, ink manufacturing, and various other industrial uses. Mauritania had acacia forests in the Sahel zone, and by the 18th century the gum Arabic trade had become absolutely critical to the regional economy. The Trarza and Bruckner Emirates, which controlled access to the best gum forests, suddenly had leverage over European traders who needed steady supplies, and they used that leverage ruthlessly. European traders, primarily French, but also Dutch and English, would set up trading posts along the coast and the Senegal River, and the emirs would charge them customs, which was basically a protection racket dressed up in diplomatic language. You want to buy our gum Arabic? Great! Pay us first, or we'll raid your trading post and make your life miserable. And the Europeans paid, because gum Arabic was valuable enough to justify the expense. This led to what historians call the gum trade wars, periodic conflicts over trading rights, customs payments, and who got to control access to the forests. It was economic warfare with occasional actual warfare thrown in. The French, who'd established a major trading hub at Saint-Louis in Senegal in 1659, were particularly invested in maintaining good relationships with the emirs. They'd negotiate treaties, pay annual customs, give gifts to influential leaders, and generally try to keep the trade flowing smoothly. But it was always a precarious arrangement. One bad harvest, one insult to an emir's honour, one rival European trader offering better terms, and the whole system could collapse into raiding and conflict. Commerce in this period required both business acumen and military preparedness. Now let's talk about slavery, because we can't discuss this period honestly without addressing it. Slavery was deeply, systematically embedded in Mauritanian society, both domestic slavery within the region and participation in the trans-Saharan slave trade. People were enslaved through warfare, raids into the Senegal River Valley and other sub-Saharan regions, and hereditary bondage where the children of enslaved people were automatically enslaved themselves. This wasn't a small-scale thing. This was a major institution affecting a substantial portion of the population. Enslaved people did everything from domestic labour to agricultural work to herding to skilled crafts. They had essentially no legal rights. They could be bought, sold, inherited, and given as gifts. And the social stigma attached to slavery was so strong that even after people were freed becoming Haratin, they and their descendants remained in a subordinate social position. The hierarchy was explicit. Hassan warriors at the top, then Zawaya scholars, then Znaga tributaries, then Haratin, then enslaved peoples. And this hierarchy would persist horrifyingly into the modern era. We'll get to that. But alongside this brutal social reality, you had this incredibly sophisticated cultural production. Poetry, in particular, was taken seriously in a way that's hard to overstate. Elaborate verses in Hassaniya Arabic, which was emerging as the dominant spoken language, blending Arabic and Berber influences, were composed, memorized, and performed at gatherings. These weren't just entertainment. These were political weapons. A well-crafted satirical poem could destroy someone's reputation. A praise poem could elevate a leader's status. Poets were respected, feared, and sometimes assassinated for verses that cut too deep. The oral tradition remained central, but you also had written poetry, religious texts, legal documents, and correspondence flowing between scholars. Literacy in Arabic was prized among the educated elite, and Islamic scholarship provided a common intellectual framework that crossed tribal boundaries. Sufi brotherhoods, particularly the Qadiriyya and Tijaniya orders, gained influence, offering spiritual practices, social networks, and sometimes political power. Religion and politics were inseparable. Daily life for most people, meanwhile, continued to revolve around herding, migrating with the seasons, and surviving in an environment that offered no margin for error. You'd wake before dawn, pack your tent onto camels, and move to wherever the last rains had left some vegetation, maybe 10 kilometers away, maybe 50. Your entire world was what you could carry. Your wealth was livestock that could die in a drought. Droughts came and went, sometimes lasting years, killing livestock and forcing desperate migrations. Locust plagues would devastate crops in the south where some agriculture was possible. Desertification kept pushing southward, consuming grazing land and forcing people to compete over shrinking resources. And through all of this, the social hierarchy remained intact. The Emirates kept fighting, and people kept adapting because adaptation was the only alternative to extinction. European presence during this period was limited to coastal trading posts and tentative diplomatic relationships. The Portuguese had explored the Atlantic coast back in the 15th century, but they didn't establish permanent settlements in what's now Mauritania. The French were the most persistent European presence, but even they didn't try to conquer territory, they just wanted stable trading relationships. The emirs were recognized as independent rulers who controlled their own territories, and Europeans negotiated with them as sovereign powers. That dynamic would change dramatically in the 19th century, but for now, Mauritania remained firmly under local control. Internal conflicts consumed far more energy than European relations. Blood feuds between tribes could last for generations, sparked by stolen livestock, disputes over water access, or insults that demanded revenge. Raiding was endemic if you had valuable camels or controlled a good well. Someone else wanted them, and they might just show up with armed men to take them. Emirs tried to maintain order within their spheres of influence, but their authority was always contingent on their ability to project strength and distribute rewards to followers. By the mid-1800s, you had a region that was culturally sophisticated, economically active, politically fragmented, and socially stratified in ways that made upward mobility nearly impossible. The Hassan Zawaya division was entrenched. The Emirates were stable enough to maintain trade relationships, but unstable enough to fight periodic wars. Islamic scholarship was producing significant work. The slave trade was ongoing and brutal, and European interest was growing, slowly but steadily, as French colonial ambitions expanded across West Africa. The basic patterns established in this period: tribal hierarchies, emirate politics, Islamic authority, trade relationships with Europeans, and the central importance of controlling water and trade routes would all carry forward into the colonial era. But the days of emirate independence were numbered. The French were about to decide that trading relationships weren't enough, that they wanted territorial control, and that Mauritania would make a nice addition to their West African empire. That's where things get complicated. Chapter 4. How to spend 30 years conquering a desert nobody wanted. So the French looked at their growing West African empire in the late 1800s and thought, you know what would really complete this collection? That massive stretch of desert to the north where people shoot at us and nothing valuable grows. To be fair, they had reasons. They wanted to connect their territories, control the trade routes, and prevent other European powers from claiming the region. But Mauritania was not going to be an easy addition to the empire. The emirs had zero interest in becoming French subjects. The population was armed and mobile, and the terrain was actively hostile to conventional military campaigns. The initial French strategy, starting in the 1850s under Governor Louis Faidherbe of Senegal, was to expand northward from their base at Saint Louis. They'd push into the Senegal River Valley, establish military posts, sign treaties with amenable leaders, and gradually extend control. It worked in some places. In Mauritania, it mostly resulted in French outposts getting raided and French officials learning that pacification in the desert was going to take significantly more effort than anticipated. The emirs were not interested in treaties that involved giving up sovereignty, and the nomadic warriors were extremely good at hit-and-run tactics that conventional European armies struggled to counter. Enter Xavier Copolani, a French colonial administrator who became convinced he could bring Mauritania under control through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic outreach to religious leaders. He launched his pacification campaign in 1901, trying to win over Zawaya tribes by presenting French rule as compatible with Islamic law, while simultaneously using military force against resistant Hassan tribes. It was going about as well as you'd expect, which is to say, not great when in 1905 he was assassinated. Turns out a lot of people really didn't appreciate his pacification efforts. But Copolani's death didn't stop French expansion, it just made it more overtly military. The French brought in more troops, established more forts, and kept pushing into Emirate territories. The Emirate of Trarza fought back hard. Various tribal leaders launched raids on French positions. And then you had Sheikh Ma al-Ainin, a hugely influential Sufi scholar and resistance leader operating from southern Morocco and the Western Sahara region, who declared jihad against the French and rallied support across multiple tribes. This guy was legendary, a religious authority, a military leader, and a symbol of resistance who managed to unite groups that normally spent their time fighting each other. The French response was methodical and brutal. They'd advance into a region, fight whoever resisted, build a fort, leave a garrison, and move on to the next area. Local resistance would sometimes force them to retreat or abandon positions, which meant they'd have to come back and do it again. The cycle was exhausting for both sides. French soldiers died of dehydration, disease, and ambushes in terrain they didn't understand. Mauritanian fighters faced artillery, machine guns, and an enemy that kept coming back with more resources. This wasn't a clean conquest with a decisive battle and a surrender ceremony. This was a grinding, decades-long process of military campaigns, guerrilla warfare, temporary truces that inevitably collapsed, and renewed fighting that consumed lives and resources on a scale that made little strategic sense given what France was actually gaining. Mauritania was declared a French protectorate in 1903 and a full colony in 1920, but actual French control over the interior remained theoretical. Nomadic groups in the desert basically ignored the colonial administration because the French couldn't effectively police areas where people moved constantly and knew the terrain infinitely better than any colonial official. The final pacification didn't happen until 1934, when the French finally subdued resistance in the Adrar region. That's 30-plus years of military campaigns to conquer a territory that, economically speaking, was almost worthless. Because here's the thing, the French didn't even want Mauritania for its resources. Unlike Senegal with its agricultural potential or Ivory Coast with its cocoa, Mauritania had sand, more sand, and some acacia trees that produced a gum that was becoming less valuable every year. There was no plantation economy to establish, no rubber or palm oil to extract, no major mineral deposits that anyone knew about yet. The French were conquering this place primarily for strategic reasons, to connect their territories, prevent Spanish or British claims, and eliminate the possibility of an independent state that could threaten their other colonies. The colonial administration they set up reflected this lack of interest. Initially, Mauritania wasn't even governed from within its own borders, it was administered from St. Louis in Senegal, which gives you some sense of how little the French cared about developing local infrastructure. When they did eventually establish a capital, they chose Nouadhibou on the coast, then later moved it to Nouakchott, which in the 1930s was barely a village. We're talking a few hundred people living in a fishing settlement. The French basically said, "This will be the capital," planted a flag, and called it a day. Colonial governance was thin on the ground. You had military governors, a small number of French administrators, and not much else. The French tried to rule through a combination of direct control in coastal areas and indirect rule through compliant tribal leaders in the interior, but their actual administrative reach was limited. Nomadic populations, which were the majority, were essentially ungovernable by a sedentary colonial bureaucracy. You can't effectively tax or control people who move with the seasons and can disappear into the desert when officials show up. The French did officially abolish slavery, because that was the civilized European thing to do. Enforcement, however, was essentially non-existent. Traditional slavery continued under different terminology and with various workarounds. Masters would claim enslaved people were servants or dependents. The social hierarchy that placed certain groups in permanent bondage remained intact. French officials either didn't care enough to enforce abolition or recognized that trying to dismantle such a deeply embedded system would trigger massive resistance they couldn't handle, so they declared victory on paper and ignored the reality. Economic development was minimal. The French imposed some taxes, which were difficult to collect from nomadic populations who didn't use currency and could simply move away from tax collectors. They built a few roads, primarily for military purposes, connecting garrison towns and coastal areas. No railways, very few schools or hospitals. Infrastructure investment in Mauritania was a fraction of what France put into colonies like Senegal or Ivory Coast. Why invest heavily in a place that wasn't producing revenue and didn't have exploitable resources. The discovery of iron ore deposits near Zouerat in the interior was potentially significant, but exploitation didn't begin until the very late colonial period. The deposits were huge, some of the largest in the world, but they were in the middle of the desert, far from any coast, with no existing infrastructure. Developing them would require massive investment in railways and port facilities, which the French weren't interested in funding until after World War II, when they started thinking about maximising colonial resource extraction. Speaking of World War II, when France fell to Germany in 1940, Mauritania came under Vichy French control until 1942. The actual impact on Mauritania was minimal because it was too remote and strategically unimportant to matter in the broader war. Some Mauritanians were conscripted into French colonial forces, but the colony itself remained a backwater that both sides basically ignored. After the war, the colonial system continued as before, though the broader French Empire was starting to face serious pressure for reform. The post-war period brought some changes, at least on paper. In 1946, France created the French Union, transforming colonies into overseas territories with limited political representation. Mauritanians could theoretically elect representatives to assemblies, though the franchise was extremely restricted and the representatives had minimal power. But it did create space for political organising, and a small, educated elite people who'd been through French schools, worked in the colonial administration, or studied abroad started forming political parties and discussing Mauritania's future. The key question was, what future? Mauritania was an artificial creation of French colonialism. Its borders had been drawn arbitrarily, cutting across tribal territories and grouping together populations with very different ethnic, linguistic and cultural backgrounds. You had Arab Berber Moorish populations in the north and centre, who spoke Hassaniya Arabic, practiced nomadic pastoralism, and saw themselves as part of the broader Arab and Islamic world. And you had black African populations, Pulaar, Soninke, Wolof in the south along the Senegal River, who practiced settled agriculture, spoke completely different languages, and had stronger cultural ties to sub-Saharan Africa than to the Arab Maghreb. These groups had different languages, different social structures, different economies, and different relationships to the land. What held them together? Basically just French colonial administration and arbitrary borders drawn on maps in Paris. Remove the French, and it wasn't clear what would keep this country from fragmentating immediately. Morocco, meanwhile, was claiming that Mauritania was historically part of Moroccan territory and should be incorporated into Morocco upon independence. Some Mauritanians agreed, seeing themselves as culturally and religiously closer to Morocco than to sub-Saharan Africa. Others wanted to join Mali, which made geographic sense given the shared Sahel environment and some ethnic connections. And then there were those who argued for an independent Mauritanian state, which would require building a national identity essentially from scratch. The 1950s saw increasing political activism. The Loi Cadre of 1956, a framework law that gave African territories more autonomy, accelerated political organisation. Political parties formed, generally splitting along ethnic lines or competing visions of Mauritania's future. And one figure emerged as particularly influential, Mokhtar Ould Daddah, a French-educated lawyer who would become the architect of Mauritanian independence. He formed the Parti du Regroupement Mauritanien in 1958 and began building a coalition around the idea of an independent, multi-ethnic Mauritanian state. In 1958, France held a referendum across its African territories. Join the new French community as autonomous states, or choose immediate independence. Mauritania voted to become autonomous within the French community, which was a middle path, more self-governance, but still tied to France. And then on November 28, 1960, Mauritania became fully independent as the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, with Mokhtar Ould Daddah as its first president. Morocco immediately refused to recognize the new state, insisting Mauritania was Moroccan territory. This created a tense situation where Mauritania was independent, but not universally recognized, which complicated everything from international relations to UN membership. It would take until 1969 for Morocco to finally drop its territorial claim and recognize Mauritania's sovereignty, and even then, the relationship remained complicated. The colonial period left Mauritania in rough shape. Infrastructure was minimal, a few roads, barely any schools, almost no healthcare facilities, and a capital city that was essentially being built from nothing. The economy was underdeveloped and heavily dependent on subsistence pastoralism. Traditional social hierarchies, including slavery despite official abolition, remained intact. Ethnic and racial divisions between Moorish and Black African populations had been largely ignored by the French, but would become major fault lines in independent Mauritania, and there was no real national identity beyond the people living within these arbitrary borders that France drew. But there was also potential, those massive iron ore deposits that hadn't been developed, rich fishing waters along the Atlantic coast, a population that had survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth for centuries and knew how to adapt to impossible conditions. And perhaps most importantly, independence, the chance to determine their own future rather than being an afterthought in someone else's empire. Whether Mauritania could actually build a functioning state from these pieces was an open question. And the answer, as we'll see, was complicated. Chapter 5: Coups, Droughts, and the Slavery That Wouldn't Go Away. Independence arrived in November 1960, and Mauritania's first president, Mokhtar Ould Daddah, inherited a country that was less a nation than a collection of problems wrapped in arbitrary colonial borders. He had to build a functioning state from essentially nothing, no real infrastructure, no industrial base, no educational system worth mentioning, and a capital city that was literally a fishing village with delusions of grandeur. Nouakchott in 1960 had maybe 500 people. By 1978, it would have over 100,000, most living in hastily constructed shanty towns, because nobody had planned for the fact that droughts would force massive rural to urban migration. Daddah's big challenge was forging a national identity that could hold together populations with very little in common. You had Arab Berber Moorish groups who identified culturally with the Maghreb and the broader Arab world. You had Black African populations, Pulaar, Soninke, Wolof, whose languages, cultural practices and historical connections were to sub-Saharan Africa. And these groups didn't just have different cultures, they had different economies, different social structures, and in many cases, a history of one group enslaving the other. Building national unity from this was like trying to make a coherent meal from ingredients that actively repel each other. Daddah tried. He positioned Mauritania as a bridge between Arab North Africa and Black Sub-Saharan Africa, emphasized Islamic identity as a unifying force, and attempted to balance ethnic representation in government positions. But he also pursued Arabization policies, making Arabic the official language, promoting Arabic in schools which Black African populations saw as cultural imperialism designed to marginalize them. French remained important for administration and education, which frustrated Arab nationalists. Nobody was fully satisfied, which in politics usually means you're either doing something right or about to get overthrown. The economy was another nightmare. Mauritania needed revenue, and it had exactly two things foreigners wanted: iron ore and fish. Iron ore mining began in 1963 near Zouerat in the north, operated by a state mining company called SNIM with foreign investment. They built a railway from the mines to the port at Nouadhibou, and this railway is genuinely impressive. We're talking trains that can be 2.5 kilometers long, some of the longest in the world, hauling iron ore across the desert in conditions that destroy equipment and require constant maintenance. It became a critical revenue source, but iron ore prices fluctuate with global demand, so your national budget is hostage to market forces you can't control. Fishing was the other big earner. The Atlantic waters off Mauritania are incredibly rich due to that cold current upwelling we talked about earlier, and foreign fishing fleets, European, Asian, you name it, were willing to pay for licenses to fish there, which provided revenue but also meant Mauritania was selling access to its natural resources while its own fishing industry remained underdeveloped and foreign boats were steadily depleting fish stocks. It's the classic resource curse. You have valuable assets, but you lack the capital and technology to exploit them yourself, so you sell access cheap and watch others profit. And then there was slavery. The French had officially abolished it. It continued anyway, so in 1981 Mauritania abolished it again, and it continued anyway, because here's the thing about slavery in Mauritania. It wasn't just an economic system. It was woven into the social fabric so deeply that official abolition meant essentially nothing without massive social restructuring that nobody in power wanted to undertake. The Haratin freed slaves and their descendants remained in subordinate positions. Enslaved people in practice, even if not legally, continued to work without wages, without rights, and without realistic options for escape. We'll get to the criminalization that finally happened in 2007, but spoiler alert, even that didn't solve the problem. Dada's presidency became increasingly authoritarian. He banned opposition parties in 1964, establishing a one-party state. This was fairly common in post-colonial Africa, the logic being that multi-party systems would exacerbate ethnic divisions and threaten national unity. In practice, it usually meant consolidating power, suppressing dissent, and creating governments that were accountable to nobody. Dada was relatively moderate by regional standards, no mass purges, no cult of personality, no grotesque human rights violations on the scale of some of his contemporaries, but moderate authoritarianism is still authoritarianism. Then came the Western Sahara disaster. When Spain withdrew from Western Sahara in 1975, Morocco and Mauritania decided to divide the territory between them through the Madrid Accords. The Sahrawi people who actually lived there had other ideas. The Polisario Front, a Sahrawi independence movement, launched a guerrilla war against both countries. Morocco could handle it, they had a real military. Mauritania could not. The Polisario raids were devastating. They attacked the iron ore railway, disrupting the main source of government revenue. They hit military installations. They made the war economically ruinous and militarily unwinnable. The war was spectacularly unpopular domestically. Mauritanians hadn't signed up to fight and die over a desert territory that had nothing to do with their own survival. The economy was tanking. The military was humiliated, and in July 1978, the military decided they'd had enough. Colonel Mustafa Ould Salek led a coup, overthrew Dada, and the civilian government era ended after 18 years. Mauritania withdrew from Western Sahara in 1979, renounced all territorial claims, and left Morocco to continue the fight alone. It was a rational decision that came too late to save Dada's presidency. What followed was a parade of military coups and juntas that would have been darkly comedic if it weren't destroying people's lives. Mauritania cycled through leaders like they were trying to speedrun political instability. Colonel Mohamed Kona Ould Haidallah took power in 1980. and actually tried some reforms. He abolished slavery again in 1981, still didn't stick, but points for optimism, and attempted to address corruption. Then, in 1984, Colonel Muawiyah Old Sid Ahmed Taya overthrew him and established what would become the longest post-independence presidency, lasting until 2005. Taya's rule was authoritarian, increasingly paranoid, and marked by escalating ethnic tensions. The late 1980s and early 1990s were particularly horrific. In 1989, a border dispute with Senegal spiraled into ethnic violence on both sides of the frontier. Mauritanians of Senegalese descent, mostly black Africans, were expelled, had their property seized, or were killed. Simultaneously, Senegalese mobs in Senegal attacked Mauritanian-owned shops and killed Mauritanian residents. Tens of thousands of people were displaced. Communities that had existed for generations were destroyed overnight. But that was just the beginning. Between 1989 and 1991, the Mauritanian government carried out what can only be described as a campaign of terror against black Mauritanian populations, particularly the Pulaar, Soninke, and Wolof groups. Military officers and civilians were arrested, tortured, and killed. Mass deportations sent thousands to Senegal and Mali. The death toll is estimated at 500 to 600 people through extrajudicial killings, with thousands more tortured or disappeared. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic, state-sponsored targeting of ethnic minorities that the government saw as threats to Moorish dominance. The trauma from this period is still present. Properties were seized and never returned. People were expelled and never allowed back. The government has never fully acknowledged what happened, let alone provided justice or reparations. It's one of those historical atrocities that gets swept under the rug because dealing with it would require confronting the ethnic divisions that still define Mauritanian politics. Meanwhile, the droughts kept coming. The 1970s and 80s saw recurring droughts that devastated the nomadic pastoral economy that most rural Mauritanians depended on. Livestock died in massive numbers, entire herds wiped out when water sources dried up and vegetation disappeared. Grazing lands turned to dust. Traditional migration routes that had sustained nomadic groups for centuries became death traps where nothing could survive. People who'd lived nomadic lives for generations, whose entire identity was built around herding and following the rains, were forced into cities because the traditional way of life was no longer viable. They arrived in Nouakchott with camels they couldn't feed and skills that had no market value in an urban economy. Nouakchott exploded in population, unplanned, chaotic, with sprawling slums around the edges as rural refugees arrived with nothing and nowhere else to go. Desertification accelerated, consuming land that had been marginal but survivable, and turning it into uninhabitable wasteland that couldn't support even the hardiest vegetation. Economically, Mauritania remained trapped in the same pattern, exporting raw materials, iron ore, fish at prices determined by global markets, importing manufactured goods and food, accumulating debt, and periodically begging the IMF and World Bank for loans that came with structural adjustment conditions. Cut government spending, privatize state industries, devalue your currency, the standard neoliberal prescription that theoretically promotes growth but often just makes poor countries poorer while enriching local elites and foreign investors. In the 1990s, there was a brief flirtation with political reform. A new constitution in 1991 allowed multi-party politics. Elections were held. Taya won in 1992, 1997, and 2003. These elections were widely regarded as fraudulent. Opposition parties existed on paper but were harassed, restricted, and given no realistic chance of winning. The media had slightly more freedom but was still heavily controlled. It was democratic theatre designed to appease international donors without actually giving up power. Taya did align himself with Western interests, particularly the United States after 9/11. He positioned Mauritania as a partner in counter-terrorism efforts, which brought in aid and weapons but also made him more enemies domestically. Islamic opposition groups emerged, were sometimes banned, and contributed to an increasingly fragmented political landscape where nobody trusted anybody and violence always seemed like a possibility. In August 2005, while Taya was abroad, the military staged another coup. The Military Council for Justice and Democracy, because every coup needs a noble-sounding name, took power, led by Colonel Eliold Mohammed Val. And here's the shocking part. They actually meant it when they promised a democratic transition. They drafted a new constitution in 2006. They held elections in 2007. And those elections were genuinely free and fair, which almost never happens after military coups. Sidi Ould Sheikh Abdullahi won that election and became Mauritania's first freely elected president in its entire history. It was a moment of genuine hope. Maybe, after decades of coups and authoritarianism and ethnic violence and economic stagnation, Mauritania was finally going to have a functional democratic government that represented all its people. That hope lasted approximately 1 year. In August 2008, General Mohammed Ould Abdelaziz staged a coup and overthrew Abdullahi. Because of course he did. So by the end of this period, let's say 2008, Mauritania had cycled through multiple coups, multiple constitutions, multiple attempts at democracy that either failed or were overthrown. Slavery had been officially abolished at least twice and criminalized once, but still existed in practice. Ethnic divisions between Moorish and Black African populations remained deep and unresolved, scarred by violence that had never been properly addressed. The economy was dependent on extractive industries that enriched elites while most people remained poor. Nouakchott had grown into a sprawling, unplanned city of over 1 million people, many living in poverty, and the desert kept expanding, consuming land and livelihoods. It's a grim picture, but Mauritania hadn't collapsed entirely. The state, however dysfunctional, still functioned. People survived, adapted, found ways to make do in impossible circumstances. And there were still possibilities. Oil had been discovered offshore, mining continued, and there remained a resilient population that had weathered worse. Whether Mauritania could actually address its deep structural problems or would continue cycling through coups and crises was the question hanging over everything as the country entered the modern era. Chapter 6. Gas fields, activists in prison, and a desert getting angrier. So General Mohammed Ould Abdelaziz staged his coup in 2008, and the international community did what the international community always does, condemned it strongly, threatened sanctions, and then gradually accepted it once Aziz held elections in 2009 and won the presidency. Which, fine, the elections were probably more legitimate than Taya's fraudulent exercises, but let's not pretend overthrowing a democratically elected president and then legitimizing yourself through elections you organize is a model of democratic governance. Still, Aziz brought a kind of stability that Mauritania hadn't seen in decades, even if that stability came with the usual authoritarian trade-offs. He ruled until 2019, when constitutional term limits forced him to step down, and here's the genuinely remarkable part. He actually stepped down. He didn't try to amend the constitution to extend his rule. He didn't stage another coup to stay in power. He handed over authority to his defense minister Mohammed Ould Ghazouani, who won elections that were, by Mauritanian standards, reasonably fair. And then, even more remarkably, Aziz was investigated for corruption after leaving office. In most countries, former presidents enjoy immunity and comfortable retirements. In Mauritania, Aziz got arrested in 2021 on allegations of embezzlement and illicit enrichment. Whether this represents genuine accountability or political score settling is debatable, but either way, it's unusual. But let's talk about slavery, because we have to. In 2007, just before that brief democratic experiment got couped, slavery was finally criminalized. Not just abolished on paper like all the previous times, actually made illegal with criminal penalties. The law was strengthened in 2015, defining slavery as a crime against humanity and increasing penalties. And yet, slavery continues, right now, in the 21st century, in a country that has smartphones and internet and participates in international institutions. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 90,000 and 150,000 people, possibly more, are still enslaved in Mauritania. These aren't historical echoes or metaphorical bondage. These are people who are owned, who work without wages, who can be bought and sold, whose children are automatically enslaved because slavery is hereditary. It's concentrated among the Haratin community, descendants of black Africans who were enslaved by Moorish masters generations ago. And the government's response to this ongoing atrocity is to deny it exists, while simultaneously arresting and prosecuting the activists who try to talk about it. Biram Dar Abeid is the most prominent of these activists. He's run for president twice, founded the Initiative for the Resurgence of the Abolitionist Movement, and been arrested repeatedly for his work. In 2016, he came second in the presidential election, a formerly enslaved person running against the establishment and getting significant support, and the government's reward was to continue harassing him and his organization. The message is clear. We've passed laws against slavery because the international community made us, but we're not actually going to enforce them. And if you make too much noise about it, you're the problem. Why does slavery persist despite criminalization? Because it's embedded in social structures that have existed for centuries. Because masters believe they have a traditional and even religious right to own certain people. Because enslaved people often lack education, resources, or knowledge of their legal rights. Because when someone escapes, they face social ostracism, economic hardship, and sometimes violence. Because the police and courts often side with masters or simply refuse to get involved. And because large portions of Mauritanian society either benefit from the system or don't see it as a problem worth addressing. The terrorism threat is another major ongoing challenge, though Mauritania has handled it better than its neighbours. Between 2005 and 2011, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb carried out a series of attacks, kidnapping foreign tourists, killing expatriates, bombing markets, targeting security forces. The Nouakchott market attack in 2009 was particularly brutal. But since around 2011, Mauritania has been relatively successful at keeping major attacks at bay, largely through increased security measures, military cooperation with France and the United States, and some degree of luck. The threat hasn't disappeared. The Sahel region, which includes parts of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and others, is dealing with multiple jihadist insurgencies, ethnic conflicts, and state collapse. Mauritania shares porous borders with this chaos. Fighters can cross relatively easily. Arms flow through the desert. But Mauritania has so far avoided the catastrophic instability that's consumed its neighbours, partly through security measures, and partly because there's just less to fight over in a country that's 90% desert with minimal infrastructure. Economically, Mauritania is still stuck in the same extractive pattern, though with some new wrinkles. Iron ore exports continue via SNIM, subject to global price fluctuations. Offshore oil production began in 2006 with the Chinguetti field, which initially seemed promising, but turned out to have smaller reserves than expected and declining output. But there's a major gas field, the Greater Tortue Amayam field, shared with Senegal, that's expected to start production in the 2020s and could genuinely transform the economy if managed properly, which is a big if given Mauritania's track record with resource management and corruption. Fishing remains economically critical but environmentally problematic. Foreign fleets, Chinese, European, Russian, pay for licenses to fish Mauritanian waters, providing government revenue but also depleting fish stocks at unsustainable rates. Mauritania is trying to develop its own domestic fishing industry, processing facilities and export capacity, but it's competing with massive foreign operations that have better technology and more capital. The waters are incredibly productive, but overfishing and warming ocean temperatures are reducing catches, and when the fish run out, that revenue source disappears. Poverty remains stubbornly high. Somewhere around 40 to 50% of the population lives below the poverty line, depending on how you measure it. Youth unemployment is a serious problem. You've got a population where the majority is under 25, many with limited education, facing an economy that doesn't generate enough jobs. This creates all the conditions for instability. Frustrated young people with no economic prospects, vulnerable to recruitment by extremist groups, or tempted to risk everything trying to migrate to Europe. And migration is a huge issue. Mauritanians are among the West African migrants attempting the dangerous journey across the Sahara and Mediterranean to reach Europe. Some are fleeing poverty or political repression. Some are seeking economic opportunities that don't exist at home. And Mauritania itself has become a transit point for sub-Saharan migrants from Senegal, Mali, and beyond who are heading north. This creates diplomatic tensions with Europe, which wants Mauritania to serve as a border guard preventing migration, and humanitarian concerns about the treatment of migrants passing through. Ethnic tensions, those deep fault lines between Moorish and Black African populations, remain unresolved. The atrocities of 1989 to 1991 have never been properly addressed. No truth and reconciliation process, no serious reparations. Properties seized from black Mauritanians in that period were never returned. Some victims are still stateless, having had their citizenship stripped and never restored. Arabic is the official language. French is used administratively, and indigenous languages spoken by black African populations are marginalized in education and government. Discrimination in employment, education, and political representation continues. The government is dominated by Moors. Key economic positions are held by Moors. The military leadership is Moorish. Black Mauritanians are underrepresented in proportion to their population and face systemic barriers to advancement. And when they organize to demand equal rights or address historical injustices, they're accused of threatening national unity or promoting ethnic division. Human rights more broadly are a mess. Beyond slavery and ethnic discrimination, you've got restrictions on freedom of expression, journalists arrested for critical coverage, blasphemy laws used to silence dissent. In 2014, a blogger named Mohammed Sheikh Old Mohammed was sentenced to death for blasphemy after writing something critical about Islam's treatment of lower castes. The sentence was later commuted following international pressure, but the message was sent: certain topics are off limits, and the penalty for crossing those lines can be your life. Climate change is making everything worse. Desertification is accelerating. The Sahara is expanding southward. consuming grazing land, and making nomadic pastoralism increasingly unviable. Droughts are becoming more frequent and severe. Water scarcity, already a defining feature of Mauritanian life, is intensifying. Nouakchott is threatened by coastal erosion and rising sea levels. The capital city could literally be partially underwater by the end of this century. Sandstorms are increasing in frequency and intensity, and all of this is happening to a country that has minimal resources to adapt. Food security is precarious. Mauritania imports most of its food because very little can be grown domestically in a country that's mostly desert. Global food price spikes hit hard. Supply chain disruptions during COVID-19 caused serious problems. Fishing stocks are declining, reducing a critical protein source. The entire food system is vulnerable to external shocks that Mauritania can't control, and climate change is making all of those shocks more likely and more severe. Nouakchott itself has grown into a sprawling city of roughly 1.5 million people, nearly a third of the country's entire population crammed into a city that was never planned to handle that many people. Infrastructure is struggling. Water supply is inadequate. Electricity is unreliable. Roads flood during the brief rainy season. Informal settlements and slums sprawl across the landscape. The city keeps growing as rural people flee drought and desertification, but there aren't enough jobs, housing, or services to absorb them all. And yet, there are reasons for cautious optimism. The 2019 transfer of power from Aziz to Ghazouani was peaceful and followed constitutional procedures, which is genuinely significant for a country with Mauritania's history of coups. Ghazouani has made some anti-corruption efforts, most notably going after his predecessor, which suggests at least some commitment to accountability. The gas field development could provide substantial revenue if managed transparently and used for genuine development rather than enriching elites. Security is relatively stable compared to neighbouring countries. The terrorism threat exists but hasn't consumed the state the way it has in Mali or Burkina Faso. The diaspora maintains connections and sends remittances that support families. There's a young, growing population that could be an asset if the education system improves and jobs are created. Civil society organisations, despite restrictions, continue working on issues from slavery to women's rights to environmental protection. Mauritania in the 2020s is a country still wrestling with the same fundamental questions it's faced since independence. Can you build a unified nation from populations with different languages, cultures, and historical grievances? Can you create an economy that doesn't just extract resources for foreign markets but actually develops domestic capacity? Can you address historical injustices, slavery, ethnic violence, land seizures without tearing the country apart? Can you govern democratically in a society with deep authoritarian tendencies and competing visions of what the country should be? The answers aren't clear. What is clear is that Mauritania is still here, still functioning despite everything that should have destroyed it. The desert hasn't consumed it. Coups haven't permanently fragmented it. Ethnic divisions haven't sparked full-scale civil war. Economic crises haven't led to state collapse. It's a testament to the resilience of people who've survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, who've adapted to droughts and dictators and devastating wars, who've built lives and communities despite systems designed to keep them powerless. The future is uncertain. Climate change will keep pushing people out of rural areas into cities that can't absorb them. The gas revenues might fund development or might just enrich a new generation of elites. Political stability might continue or might collapse in another coup. Slavery might finally be eradicated or might persist for another generation. Ethnic divisions might be addressed or might explode into violence. It could go a lot of different ways. But Mauritania has survived this long against impossible odds. It's a country that shouldn't work artificial borders, hostile environment, deep divisions, minimal resources. And yet it does work, however imperfectly. The people who wake up every day in Nouakchott or in desert encampments, who herd goats or mine iron or fight for human rights or just try to feed their families, they're writing the next chapter of this story. And whatever happens, it's their story to write. Thanks for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Mauritania, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from or which country you'd like to hear about next. Sleep well